o vas a iniciarlo?
Ya lo inicié, Alonso.
Ok, ya, sin problema, ya van a poder tener los espectadores y ya nada más lanzan.
Ya, muchísimas gracias.
No, de aquí sigo, ¿eh? Suerte.
Muchas
Gracias.
gracias, mil gracias. Priya, we started it.
All right. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending upon the space that we are in. On behalf of my co-editor, Navras Aafreedi, we warmly welcome you to the book launch of this new edition to the series on mass violence in modern history, volume entitled Conceptualizing Mass Violence, Representations, Recollections, and Reinterpretations. We are honored to have with us Dr. Sylvia Schmelkes, the academic provost at the Iberoamericana University, Mexico. Dr. Schmelkes, we would request you to give the welcome address.
Certainly, thank you very, very much. It is a pleasure for me to welcome you to Universidad Iberoamericana for this very important event in which we are launching the book Conceptualizing Mass Violence, Representations, Recollections, and Reinterpretations. I have to say that this is a sad time for our university due to the passing of our president last Thursday. But carrying on our academic activities, and such pertinent ones, such as the one we are having today, is a way of paying homage to his dedication to the enhancement of the mission of our university, which states that we strive towards a more just, solidarious, free, inclusive, and especially peaceful society. Mexico is a country in which, unfortunately, violence is endemic. It manifests itself in multiple forms: organized crime, domestic violence, ecocide with its implication on the violent loss of human lives, state violence against migrants that come from Central America wanting to reach the United States, and against our own internal migrants, not to speak of structural violence that explains great inequalities and 56 million living in poverty, or of symbolic violence and racism against our own indigenous population. Mass violence forms part of our recent history. In the last 50 years, too many episodes hurt our collective memory. What we call the dirty war against the guerrillas in the state of Guerrero in the 70s, the massacre of Acteal in Chiapas in 1997, the assassination of 27 migrants from Central America in San Fernando, Tamaulipas in 2010, the disappearance of 43 normal school students in 2014, and unfortunately, the list is longer than this. The role of universities is key in forming students to understand the causes and obtaining the ethical and technical competencies for combating these realities. The generation of knowledge about these problems, hopefully with the collaboration of those who suffer them, is key. The discussion and dissemination of these unacceptable phenomena, what we are doing today, is needed to create consciousness and to influence policy. I greet our illustrious speakers. I want to express my thanks on behalf of the university and to tell you that we are very honored to have you here today. I also welcome all of you who are participating in this virtual launch, and I tell you all, esta es su casa. Please feel at home. I am sure this will be a very interesting and fruitful event. Thank you very much and welcome again.
Thank you, Dr. Schmelkes. Thank you so much. May we now request Dr. Roger Magazine, the head of the Department of Social and Political Sciences at the Iberoamericana University, to say a few introductory words. Over to you, Dr. Magazine.
Thank you, Priya. It's an honor for us here at the Universidad Iberoamericana in Mexico City to welcome scholars from such a wide variety of institutions. including universities, research centers, and museums, and from such a wide variety of world regions. It is rare to come across a volume that includes authors from all 6 continents and that is actually weighted toward the global South. This is important because it implies that this work constitutes a truly global dialogue to deal with a truly global issue, that of mass violence. Despite fantasies of progress, illusions based on the celebration of technological advances for our consumption, the reality is that we continue to live in the age of mass violence. Social, economic, political, and technological conditions leading to acts of war, genocide, and Holocaust are clearly a part of the modern age, and they must be understood and transformed if we hope to stop them. The comparative approach that this volume offers is an important step in that direction. Only by treating acts of mass violence not as isolated events, but as part of global trends in the workings of ethnicity, religion, and nationalism, with a backdrop of greed for power and material wealth, can we hope to understand how modernity has led us to this dark place and how we can leave it behind. I would like to congratulate all of you on your collaborations that have led to this volume, and I hope that this event opens up further channels for transnational cooperative work and dialogue. I look forward to hearing your contributions today and tomorrow, and I hope that the volume sparks even greater interest in this topic in such need of attention and analysis. I would like to thank my colleague Yael Siman and her co-authors for the opportunity to share these words and to participate in this event. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Magazine, for your words, for your very kind words. And as we move on to, before we move on to the individual contributors and what they have to say about the themes that they have explored in this, what was a very interesting experience for me as a co-editor, and I'm sure it must have been for Navras as well. When we thought, or when I was invited to be a part of this volume very kindly by Navras, we were thinking of, how do we arrange this, rather rich and varied compilation of essays which deal with, multiple issues and multiple sub-themes related to what can be called as a deliberate and conscious attempt at mass violence, be it genocide or Holocaust. And the end product was a rather interesting mix of essays, which we tried organizing along the lines of narratives. The first trope was along the lines of narratives and accounts and testimonies of the survivors of the Holocaust from multiple geographical spaces, and which harped on the centrality of memory and the kind of commemorative rituals that are used to keep the memory alive, but at the same time the risks and the flips associated with these commemorative rituals, and the tendency at times to kind of water down to problematic communal narratives. So this was an important aspect which we thought could be added, or or this could add to the corpus of work on mass violence. But the major aspect has been on empirical studies and the empirical and schematic interpretations of mass violence. So the couple of essays which we clubbed together as constituting the works on narratives added on to this, to the empirical and the schematic interpretations by providing us with the informal and rather traumatic accounts, chronicles, and narratives of the survivors. The second trope around which we tried to arrange the essays was around revisionism and reconstruction. So we have a cluster of essays which talk about propaganda and the distortion of the Holocaust, which talks about episodes of genocide and Holocaust, which have been denied or rather minimized in certain spaces and along certain communities, be it in terms of, the linguistic underrepresentation in the media or other such episodes of negation of mass violence and the problems that it brings along with it. The third trope around which we managed to organize another set of essays was on education, the emergence, the opportunities, and the challenges offered by Holocaust and genocide education, cutting across spatial boundaries. Yet another set were reflections on exclusion, on victimization of certain communities who live in the margins. There is an essay which deals with trauma resulting from the coercive policies of particular regimes and dispensations. There is another one which deals with memorialization in a sort of non-conventional sense in the form of atypical museums and projects of restoration. There is an essay on the need to rethink the public discourse along post-religious and post-secular lines. But finally, there is a ray of hope in the form of the last essay, which contends with the attempts at dialogue and reconciliation. So what we have with us is a rather rich, if I may say so, a rather rich collection and varied themes associated with concerted episodes of mass violence, be it Holocaust and genocide, as I said right at the beginning. And the contributors have tried to give in what I think is, if I may say so, a very atypical, singular analysis of multiple aspects associated with mass violence. We have with us some very, very renowned authors who have agreed to contribute and who've contributed to the richness of this volume. I will now request Dr. Anita Sengupta, who's Senior Fellow at the Indian Council of Social Science Research at New Delhi, India, and also the Director of Asia and Global Affairs, which is one of the collaborating partners. She has written an essay on the state and its margins, changing notions of marginality in Turkey. Anita, we would request you to say a few words to describe your experience and elaborate upon your the theme that you've undertaken. Dr. Anita Sengupta, you have 5 minutes. Anita there?
She's right there. She has to unmute.
Good evening. I have unmuted myself. Am I audible?
Yes, Anita, you're audible. You have 5 minutes. Please go on.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. So like Priya said, my chapter is on the changing notions of marginality in Turkey. Now, marginality is generally defined in relation to a center. However, beyond the perceptions of the group's marginality often remain historical processes and social stratification. Since the foundation of the Turkish Republic in 1923, when the nation was defined as Turkish and Muslim, the issue of marginality has been at the root of a deep insecurity concerning cultural identity and what it actually means to be Turkish. The democratic opening which was offered by the AKP party had sought to redress some of these issues. However, new dimensions of the margin have been created with state recognition of a sharp differentiation between supporters of the AKP and those who have opposed its policies in the course of protests throughout Turkey. The movement around Gezi, around which my chapter is built, began in May 2013 as a protest against the implementation of an urban management project, but went far beyond its original purpose. What began as a very low-key protest against an urban planning scheme turned into a widespread movement, partly fueled by the excessive use of police force. During the period that the protests continued, the composition of the protesters and their motivations evolved. Protesters who had initially been environmentalists were soon joined by diverse groups with multiple expectations. Gezi escaped the polarization of Turkey into what Erdogan refers to as the Black Turks and the White Turks, and included men and women, Muslims and secular people, Kemalists and the Kurdish population, football enthusiasts, LGBT supporters, feminists, Alevis, Sunnis, Christians, and Jews. This eclectic collection of groups had its root in various types of grassroots activism, ranging from violent enclosures of urban and environmental commons to urban renewal projects forced by gentrification, construction of hydroelectric and thermal power plants, roads, bridges at the expense of relocation and ecological destruction, and hasty privatization of public enterprises and infrastructure, and an increasing intervention into private life, such as attempts to ban abortion or even the public consumption of alcohol. What they shared in common was their marginalization, as the state redefined its outer limits of social acceptability and belonging, was defined in terms of ideological convergence with the ruling party. This exclusion of certain groups from the state definition of who constitutes its relevant citizen itself creates the possibility of state violence. My chapter in the book is on marginality and how it was defined in terms of those whose electoral preference did not match that of the AKP. It begins by looking at the more cosmopolitan experience of Ottomanism, which is then gradually transformed as boundaries are created in Republican Turkey. What I emphasized was this group that the state marginalized was never a homogeneous one and included diverse ethnic and religious communities, others who disagreed with the ruling party on a number of issues, but eventually a huge crowd that simply hung to the trees at Gezi Park. Marginality, racism, and repression remain interlinked, therefore, in complex ways. And rather than summarize my chapter, let me read from a very interesting blog which exemplifies this rather complex relationship and illustrates why this volume on conceptualizing mass violence is important in terms of a constant reinterpretation of the theme. This is a very small blog, and the title of the blog is Sounds from Istiklal. Now, Istiklal is the equivalent of Oxford Street in Istanbul. Istiklal is the heart of modern Istanbul, it says. This huge street, visited by about 3 million people each day, is a magnet for tourists, shoppers, and street performers. It comes alive at night. Yet amongst the bustle of this busy, noisy street, a distinctive melody can be heard, one of vulnerability and of agency, of young people playing simple tunes so that they can support themselves and their families, but also of tense social relations between refugees, hosts, and their migrant communities. In the metropolis like Istanbul, Syrian refugees most often share in the poverty and precarity experienced by other marginalized communities that live in the city, from Roma communities to the Kurdish people, to Senegalese migrants to Philippine domestic workers. They also contribute to a form of poverty politics where extremely vulnerable young people are put in direct competition with one another, marking out corners of the Istiklal where they can play simple tunes in exchange for a few liras. Their origin is a matter of debate. The seemingly obvious assumption is that the street performer must be one of the Syrian refugees currently living in Istanbul. However, several Istanbul residents argue that these are not Syrian at all, but Roma children passing as Syrians by switching their language to Arabic. This differentiation, both real and imagined, between deserving Syrians and the undeserving Roman children generates social tensions between two marginalized communities. This sometimes triggers small fights between performers, where Syrian and Roma youth compete not only for the right to play their tunes in particularly lucrative areas, but also for the sympathy of their audience. In this chaotic environment, Syrian and Roma youth compete over visibility and access to space within a hectic composition of Istanbul life. Yet as the melodies of migrant and refugee youth take on a more prominent audible position within the evening symphonies of Istiklal, the realities and challenges of poverty, racism, and marginalization continues. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Anita. The next speaker is Dr. Rituparna Roy, Assistant Professor of English at the Heritage College, Kolkata, India. And she'll be elaborating upon her chapter, which talks of fabric, food, song, the quiet continuities in Bengali life 70 years after partition. Rituparna, stage is yours.
Sorry, you're muted.
Hello, good day, good afternoon, good evening to everyone here. Thank you, Navras and Priya, for inviting me to contribute, and a big thanks to Iberoamericana University for doing this book launch. I'm actually talking to you today not as a professor of English literature, but as the initiator of a museum project. And my essay is, if I have to give it a one-line summary, emphasizes the cultural continuity between West Bengal and Bangladesh despite the partition, which is almost 75 years now. So, you know, whenever we talk of partition, the first thing that comes to our mind is rupture, and rightly so. So we think of communal violence, bloodshed, forced migration, the trauma that went with it, which could not be overcome for decades, and unfortunately whose afterlives continue till today. While that is something that we cannot deny, there is and was always another side to partition, which has never been emphasized, at least in the Bengal story. And that is something that we want to emphasize, which is the cultural continuities between the two Bengals. And when I say we, I mean the Kolkata Partition Museum Trust, of which I'm the founder trustee, which steers this project that aims at establishing a partition museum in Kolkata, focusing on the Bengal experience, which was very different from the Punjab. So we have two main aims. One is to memorialize in the most comprehensive manner possible the specificity of our history of partition, its aftermath and afterlives, which I just said is very different from the Punjab, and which is usually the story that people know. The other is to, equally important, is to emphasize the cultural continuity that we have. And by continuity, what do I mean? I basically mean what we call living heritage. So fabric, food, the performative arts, language, literature, which is not a small thing, you know. And we want to do this because in an attempt to promote tolerance and in an effort to remain human, because we think that, you know, apart from changing the partition discourse, what happens is how do you prevent violence? There are various ways. One is the state apparatus, but the other thing is, you know, to remember the other aspects. So what happens is we always remember that, you know, West Bengal as a federal state within the Indian Republic and Bangladesh, and the two Bengals have had very different political trajectories as post-colonial nation states and entities, no doubt. But, you know, the cultural continuity is a reality of life, and it is such an integral part of our everyday life that we don't even remember it. We forget to theorize it. And this is something that we want to do. So in my essay, I picked up on three aspects: fabric, food, and song, and as an example of those continuities. And those three were, one is a sari that I inherited from my mother, a Dhakai, a cuisine, a special, special cuisine from a particular district of East Bengal, which, you know, continues its life here amongst several families, and that is true of many other districts and other kinds of cuisine as well. And the story of a very popular singer-songwriter who died unfortunately died young. And when he did, he was mourned on both sides of the border equally. So just a one-line elaboration of these. So my mother was a very thrifty person, you know, she would not indulge herself in anything. The only time I saw her indulge herself was in buying a Dhaka Sharia. Dhaka is a particular kind of muslin which originates from and is a speciality of the city of Dhaka. And she actually bought that sari. It was on a princely sum of 400 rupees in 1980 in installments. That was the only time she kind of gave herself to temptation. And she actually didn't wear it much, but you know, every Bengali on either side of the border, every Bengali woman will have a couple of dhakais in their wardrobe, and I have a few more, and I've actually worn that sari more than my mother on very special occasions. And she's no more, but her sari continues to be a part of her and her memory, which I prize a lot. About the cuisine that I was saying, you know, this we have a website and a Facebook page on our website. Last year we were doing a couple of guest posts on a blog, and one of my friends contributed, and her contribution was on food. So her family hails from the Chittagong district of East Bengal, and her parents, her father's family especially, came over just before and after partition. So two brothers were already there, and later her father came over. And she gave a very vivid description of her childhood through food, you know, through that particular cuisine that her family has inherited, of grandmother, aunts, etc. And you won't believe, of all the guest posts that we had over a couple of months, her post was the most popular one. It had the maximum engagements, and a lot of people commented, sharing similar stories from other districts. So this is, you know, if I start on food stories, I won't stop. It will take far more than 5 minutes. So I won't go into that. This is just one example. The other is a singer I was talking about, Kalika Prasad. He was he had a massively popular band, which continues, Dohar, which is called Chorus. So he was just not a singer-songwriter, he was also a scholar. He used to collect folk songs, and his training was under his uncle. He actually hailed from the Barak Valley of Assam, but he continued his studies in West Bengal in Jadavpur University, and he had this massively popular band, it was Singh, and he also composed for films, etc. So when he died a couple of years back, he was his main inspiration actually was from a baul singers, you know, they are like folk singers, minstrels. Shah Abdul Karim of Sylhet was his you know, main inspiration, and he met him around I think in the year 2000, which was a very important point in his life. He died very young, unfortunately, but you know, he had collected. What he did was he would collect folk songs from Assam, West Bengal, Bangladesh, and he would popularize them through his band, Dohar. But there is another very well-known singer, Moshumi Bhomik, who has done a similar thing, has been doing it for I don't know how many years now. What she does is she does field recordings of artists in their local regions, and all of them is archived in their website, the Traveling Archive. You may have a look if you want to. So what basically I'm trying to say is that, you know, these through the performative arts, and what I'm saying about folk songs is a particularly popular genre among Bengalis. And that can be extended, that can be, you know, that point can be extended to embrace the performative arts in general, and as much for folk theater as folk song. So what is this essay doing in a volume on communal violence? As I said, that, you know, this is a museum project, and it's trying to think, visualize, conceptualize, memorializing partition in a different way. Number one, by focusing on Bengal, which does not happen. Number two, on focusing on aspects by changing the narrative a bit. And the other thing is, you know, I have thought on this issue. Can a museum stem communal violence? Can it stop? Can it reduce? I'm not sure. You know, have Holocaust memorials been able to reduce anti-Semitism? Has it stopped anti-Semitism? Could genocides, if you talk of genocides, even after the Holocaust, think of the number of genocides we've had in the 20th century itself. I mean, could Cambodia stop Rwanda? I mean, I don't know, but I think the attempt should always be there. And all the partition countries that I know of, a lot of those partition countries actually have national quote unquote museums. I'm not sure how much of their partition experience is incorporated in that narrative. I have not visited. I want to do that. That's one on my agenda for many years. But I think that attempt needs to be there. In the subcontinent, you already have 2 museums memorializing this history. You have the Dhaka Liberation War Museum, which is actually about the Liberation War. Obviously, 47 and 71 are related, but for Bangladeshis, as you know, the Liberation War is of far great importance. And in Amritsar in 2017, there is a partition museum, but which actually focuses on the Punjab. So this is our attempt to fill in a lacuna, and our attempt to, and we feel that this is a conversation, especially India, I mean, the kind of divisive times that we are going through, they're just reminding people continuously that, there are these continuities, there are these connections, have always been, will always be, is very important. So this is what we're trying to do. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rituparna. We move on to Srimanti Sarkar, who's Assistant Professor in the Department of Political Science at the West Bengal State University in Kolkata. And she will be speaking on the genocide of 1971 in Bangladesh, lessons from history. Over to you, Srimanti.
Thank you. Greetings to all. Greetings to the organizers of this book launch, and very warm regards to the co-editors and editor and the co-editor, Professor Navras and Priya Singh, as well as the esteemed authors with whom I get this rare opportunity to meet, even though it's virtually. I'll quickly go discuss about my paper, my chapter. The central argument of my chapter has been to vouch that conceptualizing mass violence is not an easy task. That is the bottom line of what I have tried to argue in my paper. Conceptualizing mass violence is rather a daunting task because it runs the risk of violent transgressions. I say this because I believe that history itself is constructed, and when we recollect a constructed history, we run ourselves the risk of violent transgressions. And in order to justify and substantiate this argument, I have cited a few instances from the history of Bangladesh, which is an area of my research interest. And I think you all know that Bangladesh is a country which has been born out of a reprehensible bloodbath. It was a part of Pakistan, and in 1971, it got its independence from Pakistan. But when Bangladesh got liberated from Pakistan, the latter, that is Pakistan, while leaving Bangladesh, had unleashed a horrific genocide, right? Now, my point is that today, even Bangladesh dwells upon this history of violence, that is genocide. Now, precisely, Bangladesh still today dwells upon this history of genocide because it is unforgettable. It is unforgivable. But in my view, this reminiscing the genocide is also debilitating. Why I say it's debilitating? Because today, when we recall this genocide, we often miss, or we have to be conscious about the fact that we are recalling a constructed history which has embedded biases in it. Okay, and in order to argue this, I have put forth 3 points, like three kind of biases that we can perhaps trace analytically or critically in the history when we look into the history of Bangladesh. What are the 3 biases? Gender bias. The gender bias, in what sense? We all know that the Liberation War of Independence saw the women as the worst victims. Okay, they were simply violated, war victims, right? But they encountered double persecution by the Bangladeshi state. Okay, they encountered double persecution by the Bangladeshi state. Why? Because after independence, in order to respect the women victims, in order to improve them, in order to recognize them, acknowledge their plights, Bangladeshi state had introduced a number of policies. Some of them, there's no time to it, like, giving them the title Birangonas, in a sense to acknowledge their plight. But ultimately what happened is that that title itself added to their plight. It was some issue of marking them. It was a factor that ridiculed them. Again, there was some state policies, state initiated policies whereby the government introduced rewards to whoever marries the rape victims. It was with the intention was to uplift them. But what happened was, that policy got turned into a marry them off policy whereby people got interested to marry the Viranganas for the sake of the state rewards, like so on. Now, it was only with the development of the feminist accounts, the feminist voices, that the plights of these women victims got adequately or conspicuously or significantly accounted. But my point is that, so when we recollect such history of violence, for example, the violence of women, we run the risk of, reinvigorating that trauma. Okay, my point is that glorifying the history of liberation, war, or recollecting the war memories are problematic and symptomatic. Problematic because it reminds one of the double persecution of the women victims by the Pakistani army and then by the Bangladeshi state. It is symptomatic of the fact that history is constructed in its own gendered way by silencing and abating the women's question away from the public discourse. That had happened. This was my first story. My second story was about the story of the ethnic conflict in the CHT. CHT is Chittagong Hill Tracts, the region located in the far southeastern Bangladesh. It is a hilly region where about 12 to 14 ethnic community groups reside. It is the land of diversity, where the language, where the culture, the history is very much different from that of the mainstream Bangladeshis living in Bangladesh. Okay. Now, what happened was that after independence, the Bangladeshi state, imbued with the spirit of nationalism, went ahead to make Bangladesh a homogeneous Bengali state. Okay, it forcefully tried to impose Bengali culture upon even the people of the CHT through various means. I'm cutting the long story short. Okay, which necessarily, so the Bangladeshi state tried to impose a Bengali culture upon the CHT, which necessarily did not relate with the same. The result was what? Ethnic conflict. Okay. Now, this besetting history of systemic marginalization of the Kean people is not unknown. We know, and that is a story. Now, what is our take from that? My point is that now this root of this ethnic conflict can be linked with the memory of liberation of independence, because it is again in this liberation of independence, the history of liberation war, one can trace the growth of this eulogized concept of nationalism, which again in turn instigated this ethnic conflict. So today, when one recollects fondly the memories of liberation war, or in a sad manner, the gruesome violences of genocide, one again runs the risk of, equally revitalizing the equally violent memory of ethnic violence that the post-independent state of Bangladesh had unleashed upon certain section of its people. Okay, that is my second point. So when I'm remembering the liberation liberation war memory, the violent memory, then that is again in a way reactivating my memory of ethnocide, if we can call it, that Bangladeshi state had committed on a certain section of its own community after independence. The last story is that of the war crime trials. In 2013, the nation Bangladesh got, again, the furor regarding the war crime trials could be seen. And in Bangladesh, we saw the Shahbag movement coming, striking the headlines, and whereby the demand for war crime trials came to the fore. Now, my point is that this movement, popular movement, demanding war crimes trial, apparently looks like a movement which demands for social justice. But my take into the thing is that that movement is far more from merely a movement demanding social justice. That was a movement, but that was essentially a political movement with several complex intricacies. If we study the movement, we can find vicious politics of polarization, how that factored in that movement. We can find how violence and intolerance acted and played a major role, and how fundamentalist politics played a major role, and how democracy got encroached at various levels in various manners. So that all these things in a clear manner tells us one thing, that the movement, the popular movement, was not a simple one. It had acquired over the period of time several other imports, as a result of which that movement, which has its root in the liberation, apparently one may find that, that movement is demanding, it wants to make the wrongs correct, the wrongs of the genocide correct through the trials. But the movement, how it materialized in the 2013, clearly shows us that the movement got constructed in a new manner. It got new characteristic features. So from these three stories, I get back to my core point of the chapter. So what does these three stories tell us? It clearly tells us that the history over the period of time has acquired characteristic features. Okay, so when I am remembering the history, so when I'm recollecting, especially the history which is violent, then I run the risk of transgression, violent transgression. So so what should be done? What should be done? I believe, number one, we should not try to draw any I'm just finishing it off, Priya. I just feel like I have concluded by saying that three lessons maybe perhaps we can draw. One is that we need not think about drawing a comprehensive lesson, but only a reasonable lesson one should draw from history of violences. Number two, when we are trying to draw some lesson from mass violence, we should take into consideration the changing narratives which constantly changes. And the last point is that when we are taking into consideration violences, we should be extra careful that remembering violences has the possibility of unleashing further violences. So as scholars talking about scholars of genocide study, we should be careful about keeping factual accuracies and social conventions in mind when we try to problematize social violence. That is precisely what I had tried to argue through my paper. That's it.
Thank you so much, Srimanti. Unfortunately, we do not have Dr. Mudassir Kwamar with us today, but so we move on to the next speaker, Mr. Fuzail Siddiqui, who's a scholar in English from the Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. He will be speaking on the failure of secular publics and the rise of the Jewish religious public in Nathan Englander's For the Relief of Unbearable Urges. Fuzail, floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Singh. I hope I'm audible.
Yes, you are.
And thank you to Dr. Navras and all other panelists also, and the organizers for letting me, allowing me to speak here about my chapter. So as mentioned, the chapter is called The Failure of Secular Publics and the Rise of the Jewish Religious Public in Nathan Englander's For the Relief of Unbearable Urges. So Nathan Englander is a Jewish American author, and this collection was his debut collection of short stories, which is a collection of stories that traces the experience of Jewishness in modern times, which varies from, during the period of the World Wars to the modern day, right? In this specific chapter, I deal with 5 of Englander's stories with a particular pattern in mind, which is with regards to obviously the larger rubric that we are working under, which is of conceptualizing mass violence. Through Englander, I argue that the mass violence is not a one-off event. It is caused by multiple smaller events. So in my chapter, there are 5 stories that I discuss. 2 stories are about the Holocaust, about the experiences of the Holocaust. One is towards the religious turn towards Judaism, and 2 document a movement to a very strict religionist thought that comes out of an outcome perhaps out of an outcome of the failure of secular societies to prevent violences, both mass violence and everyday violence. My basic argument in my chapter is with regards to how Englander questions the secularization thesis, which is basically relegating religion to the periphery in the public sphere. And when I'm discussing the idea of the public sphere, or what Englander believes to be the public sphere, I'm of course discussing it with reference to the Habermasian notion of the public sphere. My argument or my reading of Englander is based on the belief that Englander suggests through his readings of, suggests through his fiction that secular society as such has promised a lot, but has been failing multiple times. The argument is that it is only, you could say, helpful to powerful people, to institutions such as the state that wield enormous power over civil society. The first two stories that are basically called the Tumbler and the story that is called, for example, the Tumblers is basically an allegorical I attempt an allegorical reading of the story to highlight that participation in the public sphere without reference to one's religiosity essentially evokes laughter. So, which is what Englander also attempts to, highlight through his fiction, that one can never really participate in the public sphere without recourse to their religious identity, right? The attempt to, remove the idea of, religiosity or one's religiosity from the public sphere and participating in the public sphere essentially deprives one's argument for, political participation, is what Englander basically tries to highlight. This chapter, in the sense, Englander through his in this chapter, for example, attempts to understand Englander's idea of the public sphere and the role of secular and religious publics in mass violence. Because, for example, Englander, while he's highlighting through his fiction the effects of, sorry, am I audible?
You are audible.
Yeah, sorry. So basically the 5 stories are, because 2 of them are based on the Holocaust, which obviously discuss the predicament the Jewish protagonists face. The other 2 stories, for example, are a movement towards what Englander suggests is religious thought, which is a movement away from secular ethics to more religious ethics, which for Englander becomes also problematic because they also negate, in a sense, one's participation in a public ethics, because religious ethics for Englander is in a way an ethical system which is very private and closed. So while Englander is obviously critical of events like the Holocaust, he is not arguing for a movement towards religious thought, because in his stories in this collection, he like, for example, the title story, which is called For the Relief of Unbearable Urges, which, if I could just give a small gist, is basically a story about a sexually frustrated man who has been given a religious dispensation by his rabbi to participate in sexual practice outside of marriage, which eventually gives him a venereal disease. The problem is that this participation in an ethical system which is outside so-called private religious ethics is harmful because it gives him a venereal disease in the story. So Englander argues that this there has to be a middle way between the secularization thesis and religionist thought, and which he actually does not really give in his collection. But as I argue towards the end of the chapter, that eschewing both religionist thought and secular ethics is not really helpful to prevent problems like mass violence and genocide. And we can take, for example, an argument from Habermas in that sense, where instead of completely disregarding both secular ethics and religious private ethics, he proposes the idea of, for example, what he calls post-metaphysical thought, which is in a way a middle path that allows the existence simultaneously of both private religious ethics and secular ethics, which is obviously deprived of any religious recourse whatsoever, right? So in this chapter, basically my argument is essentially that there has to be a middle path ethically, so as to speak, an ethical system which does not necessarily disregard both private religious ethics and secular ethics, but attempts to amalgamate both of them together to form an ethical system which in a way can deal with issues like genocide and mass violence that keep occurring throughout the 20th century. That is basically the gist of what my chapter is. Thank you.
Thank you, Suzanne. We now request Professor Suzanne D. Routledge, Emerita, University of Sydney, Australia, to kindly elaborate on her chapter on Holocaust Studies in Australia, moving from family and community remembrance to human rights and prevention of mass violence. Over to you, Professor Routledge.
Thank you, and thank you very much to both Navras and Priya for bringing this very important project to fruition. As we just heard, the 20th century has been recognized as a century of genocide. From the tragedy of the Armenians during World War I into the 21st century, millions of men, women, and children have been murdered in the name of racial, religious, and tribal purity. This included the 6 million Jews murdered during the Holocaust. Our chapter, Holocaust Studies in Australia, moving from family and community remembrance to human rights education, is really looking at how Holocaust education in Australia has moved into looking at universal issues as a way of countering prejudice, bigotry, and of course, that the way it can lead to mass violence. In Australia, around 35,000 Jewish refugees and Holocaust survivors found a safe haven before and after the war. Most embraced their new homeland, but they were reluctant to speak about their experiences. They wanted to concentrate on rebuilding their lives. We argue that Holocaust memory at first remained largely within the survivor community, such as the annual ball. And it's interesting here that the Buchenwald boys were liberated on the 11th of April, 1945. And every year they celebrated their liberation with, as we heard, song and food and dance. There were also the annual Warsaw Ghetto commemorations. But this was all very much within the community. It was only with the opening of the museums, and again, we've heard what role can museums play, and obviously there are no easy solutions, but in our view, museums do play a very important role in education. So the first one was in 1984 in Melbourne, the Jewish Holocaust Centre, which is just, by the way, being totally rebuilt. And the other in a very classical building built as a memorial after World War I, the Sydney Jewish Museum, which opened in 1992. Yet for most of the survivors who were very involved with both museums, the Holocaust was a unique event. They strongly opposed using it as an example for a broader narrative. In this period, the focus was on personal stories and the specificity of the Jewish experience. We then demonstrate how since the turn of the century, there has been a significant generational change. And here in this generational change, it's looking at moving from the particular to the universal message of human rights and the prevention of mass violence, as described by top Holocaust scholar Professor Ehud Bauer in his important book, Rethinking the Holocaust, that was published in 2001. In 2016, the Sydney Jewish Museum began a major renovation of its Holocaust exhibition, which had been opened 25 years earlier in 1992. And the rethinking is very much in that new exhibition, because right through the Holocaust section of the exhibition, it includes the story of homosexuals, the gypsies, and the disabled. However, as well, in the top level, there is a new center, which is a Holocaust and Human Rights Center, which aims to teach the universal aspects of the survivor's legacy, a legacy that once focused only on the personal, private, and Jewish origins, has been firmly established at the museum. And each of these tables that you see in the images represents another element of human rights, such as the genocides experienced by the Indigenous Australians, now as known as the Australian First Peoples, problems for homosexuality, problems for migrants, and so on. And at the back, there's a timeline highlighting some of these key issues. And for the school children who come, they have a wall where they express their reactions, and it's very, very powerful. We have also argued that Australia, by becoming a member of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, which also illustrates these new approaches to the central role Holocaust education can play in combating prejudice and bigotry. As well, Holocaust education is considered important in government programs and has been added to history curricula. And what's interesting, Sue Hampler and I, my co-author, did this table for the IRA in 2016. But since then, just now, last year, Victoria, which did not mandate for Holocaust studies, has now mandated it for years 9 and 10. And the reason for that was the exposure of significant problems of anti-Semitism among government school children. Whilst there are a number of university Holocaust programs, the problem is that these are not mandatory for history teachers. This gap in knowledge creates a challenge of the need to introduce more professional development courses on teaching the Holocaust and its complement universal message. As well, there's a huge challenge of involving groups for whom the Holocaust has less relevance, such as Muslim school children, as demonstrated by recent research. So as we really know, museums, education, they're not a panacea, but we have to try, and education is important. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Rutland. May I now request Tali Nates, the founder and director of the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center. She will be speaking on new developments in Holocaust and genocide education in South Africa, the case study of the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center. Over to you, Tali.
Thank you very much, Priya. Thank you, Navras. Thank you to all that were part of the book and this book launch. I continue this trend that Suzanne spoke about, and Ritu Pana also reflected on the museum. And how do you conceptualize mass violence in a museum setting? And this is what we try to do. Now, the case study of South Africa is really important and interesting because, of course, we are a country that is facing constantly our very difficult past of colonialism, past of racism, of apartheid, and including some of the current issues of xenophobia and racism. So how Holocaust or genocide studies in the museum can serve as an entry point to speak about ourselves? How can you go and teach other case studies and then connect it to yourself? I will share my screen and share with you some of the thoughts that I shared in the chapter. Of course, Holocaust and genocide education is relatively a new field in South Africa. South Africa is only 27 years into our democracy. So of course, this is new. And until 1994, in our democratic elections, it was basically the Jewish community that kept the memory alive, and many of the Holocaust survivors, you see them here in this slide. We just published a book this year, a publication, digital publication, you can find it on our museum's website, of the stories of survivors that settled in South Africa. But mind you that in the 1930s and during the war, immigration to South Africa was severely restricted. And there were basically very few, maybe 300 or 350 survivors that settled in South Africa after the war. They created a Holocaust organization, She'erita Pleta, and they were instrumental in assisting memory in yearly memorial commemorations. The first actually memorials in South Africa were in Jewish cemeteries. And I'm just bringing you one example that I'm speaking about in my chapter of the one in Johannesburg where I live. And this is a very moving memorial. It was established in the 1950s, and it is created by an artist, Herman Wald, in 1959 at the Johannesburg Cemetery, Jewish cemetery, a memorial to the 6 million with its 6 symbolic ram's horns or shofarot. And it's evocative, it's emotional, and Wald, I'm quoting him, said, "Through the ram's horns, the dead are blasting out the 6th commandment, thou shalt not kill." And annual commemorations are held in all those memorials throughout the big cities of South Africa. We also had traveling exhibitions that went through the country and kept the memory alive. But really, the memory was mainly in the Jewish community. Anti-apartheid activists were also part of the memory of the Holocaust and it was an entry point for many of them, including Nelson Mandela and Ahmed Kathrada, that smuggled the diary of Anne Frank to Robben Island and actually felt a keen connection to the Holocaust. And I elaborate a little bit about that in my chapter as well. I speak a little bit about the exhibition Anne Frank in Our World and how it traveled in South Africa and Namibia, and how that started a conversation about how do you speak about the Holocaust and apartheid side by side? How do you move from the paradigm that exists in South Africa, that racism is always black and white, to a different paradigm where perpetrators can be white and target whites, or perpetrators, in the case of the Holocaust, or perpetrators can be black and target blacks, like we see in the genocide in Rwanda. That shift in paradigm is really important when you speak about mass violence in South Africa. In 2007, there was a big change where the Holocaust became part of the curriculum of the country for both the 9th grade and the 11th grade. And I elaborate a little bit about the rationale behind it, why the Department of Education decided to include this topic and how is it connected to the study of apartheid. And then Holocaust centers started to be established in South Africa. The first one was established in Cape Town in 1999, the Cape Town Holocaust Center, then in Durban in 2008. And we were the new center in South Africa, established really as an idea in 2008, moved to this building that you see in 2016, and actually only opened to the public officially in March 2019. And of course, this is the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center. I then in the chapter look at what is different? What are we doing that create a discussion about beyond the Holocaust? We speak about the Herero and Nama genocide in next door Namibia, at Armenia, of course, at Rwanda, of course, at the Holocaust, but also at the concept of genocide, Raphael Lemkin and his coining of the word genocide, and of course about the Convention for the Prevention and Punishment of Genocide and its aftermath, including mass violence and genocide and crimes against humanity in South Africa until today. So that is really important. The museum is taking stories of people that settled in South Africa. I'm going to just show you that you will see the multi-layer that I'm describing in the chapter. How do you bring artifacts, music, poetry, photographs, essays into a museum space? How do you bring multi-layered stories of South Africans and the Holocaust, South Africans and Rwanda into an exhibition setting? How do you bring multiple voices, multiple directions into a museum setting? And one of the things that we do is that we bring all the stories together to one space. We are not separating the stories, we are connecting between the stories. The stories are coming one after the other with clear connections. And finally, we bring, as I said, the voices of survivors that settled in South Africa, and we bring stories of women, of men, of victims, of bystanders, of perpetrators, of resistors, of upstanders, of collaborators. And we bring it through multiple voices and through artifacts that tell a story. So for example, the late Veronica Phillips, she passed away only tragically this year in February, that donated to the museum her childhood doll. She was in 3 concentration camps and the ghetto, but the doll survived, and she donated that doll to tell her story. Or Sylvester Sendakieye, that survived in one of the churches in Rwanda and tells the story of his artifacts, his childhood shoes, and connects his story to the story. And finally, as South Africans struggle with so many issues relating to racism, to xenophobia, the national curriculum and the education and memory programs that our museum and many other museums try to do is to promote a culture of human rights and peace by challenging prejudice that involved race, class, gender, ethnicity, and othering. And the words, of course, of Auschwitz survivor and writer Primo Levi that you see here in the lobby of our museum on the wall. It happened, therefore it can happen again. This is the core of what we have to say. It can happen everywhere. Try to make a connection to the fact that the never again is only really never again with a question mark, because it is happening again and again.
Thank you so much. Can we now move to the final speaker for the day, Dr. Charles Eldridge, Program Director at the Salzburg Global Seminar, Austria, sorry. He will be speaking on Holocaust propaganda and the distortion of history in the former Soviet states. Over to you, Charles.
Thank you, Priya. Thank you for including me in this book. It's an exciting addition I found to the literature because it covers such a wide range of angles, both geographically and thematically. And it examines as a book, not just the mass violence itself, but rather the memory of mass violence and how it is used for different purposes. And if we are to learn the lessons from mass atrocities, we need to remember them properly and also learn the lessons of how they are remembered. And so it's exciting to be involved in a book which illustrates these aspects across multiple contexts and disciplines. During my own time working in the former Soviet Union and other post-communist countries, I personally witnessed the misuse of the Holocaust within current state, primarily Russian propaganda, as well as in false popular narratives in countries where the Holocaust actually took place. Not only was a Jewish presence in Eastern Europe erased by the Nazis, but also the memory of that presence has been erased 2 more times. First by communists, which has later morphed into the current Russian narrative, and subsequently by countries regaining their independence from Russian occupation. So that my chapter in this book addresses the distortion and misuse of history in this context. Differences of opinion can and do exist among scholars and historians, but where there's a willful distortion of history, then the lessons of that history will go unlearned. It was Soviet policy to downplay the fact that victims of the Holocaust were murdered because they were Jews, as this fact interfered with their political framing. The murdered people were simply victims of fascism without ever needing to define what fascism is other than the enemy of communism or respectively of Mother Russia. So the ideology behind the Holocaust was not examined. The evil is not so much genocide per se, but rather the acts of mass violence carried out by the other side. The consequence of this education coming from the former Soviet Union is that people in this geographical space do not appreciate the causes of the Holocaust, nor how it happened in their own countries. So not just how it developed in Germany, but how it was then applied across this space. The Soviet and later Russian narrative intentionally ignores the fact that the Soviet Union began the Second World War as an ally of Nazi Germany and itself committed mass atrocities both within its pre-war borders and in territories it subsequently occupied from 1939 and additionally from 1945 until the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. Propaganda needed to undermine the identities of neighboring occupied states and portray anyone with a counter narrative as somehow a fascist collaborator. So my chapter in this book looks especially at Ukraine and Poland, and to agree at other places such as Latvia as an intermediate case. Ukraine is especially interesting. It's a country that current Russian propaganda asserts does not really exist as a separate legitimate identity. Ukrainians are a fake people. If they existed differently, it's something they themselves invented. They're really all part of the Russian people. And so their territory before 1939 had been divided, and it never had in modern history a long period of independence. So it was very easy to deny Ukraine as a concept. Poland is a country with a long-standing history of independence, which was then divided in 1939 between Nazi and Soviet regimes. And after the war remained as a Soviet vassal until 1991. And the intermediate is Latvia, example that I use, a country which established itself as fully independent before 1939, but then was occupied by Russia, Germany, and Russia again before reacquiring independence in 1991. Each of these countries has a range of issues connected to citizenship during the period of occupation and before. Unlike the Nazis, who dismembered the countries they occupied in this part of the world, the Soviets incorporated the citizens of the occupied territories as Soviet citizens. So what did it mean if these citizens collaborated with the occupation in 1939, the Russian occupation in 1939 to 1941, did they have to account for that after 1941 when the Germans arrived? Did they therefore collaborate with the Germans to wash away their supposed sins of having collaborated with the intermediate 2-year occupation? How would the Soviets handle these people ideologically after they reoccupy towards the end of the war and subsequently? And with the exception of some nationalist leaders and war criminals, it was more convenient for the Soviet authorities to once again reincorporate all of these citizens and gloss over whatever happened, making victims of these people into victims of fascism. And what do you do with the missing Jewish population of these territories? If you've visited concentration camps and death sites from the Soviet period, it rarely mentioned that there were Jews involved. It's just victims of fascism. There were also reasons some people collaborated with the Germans as liberators from the Russian occupation, and in some cases that aspect can be respected. But this did not necessitate collaboration in the Holocaust. So in welcoming the Germans, you did not have to become a war criminal. In rehabilitating, though, leaders who did commit war crimes, these countries must also recognize whether these leaders themselves participated in genocide and mass atrocity, and in the Holocaust in particular, before they are properly or fully rehabilitated. There's nuances. Many citizens who, in many countries, who worked with the Germans did so out of self-preservation. We don't know how we would have behaved under those circumstances, or because they really did object to the previous Russian occupation and the consequences of that. That doesn't necessitate that they also themselves committed war crimes. And in each of these cases, Russia has sought to undermine the respective states today by continuing the obfuscations. So post-independence identities of these states have been constructed to degrees in opposition to the Russian narratives, covering up the behaviors of their own citizens during the Holocaust, which the Russians then in turn exploit to confirm their own fascist labels of the people from these states. Acknowledging that Germany singled out Jews for extermination does not deny the narratives of suffering by people in these countries at the hands of the Germans or of the Russians. Recognizing that some people from these countries participated in genocide of Jews, even willingly doing so, does not negate their country's own victimhood nor their people's identity. Indeed, it's the contrary. Recognizing history strengthens their narrative and makes it harder for Russia to undermine their contemporary state identities. So these are the aspects I try to explore in my chapter in the book, and it's a complex situation which is still playing out in many of these areas. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Charles. I think we can now move on to the question and answer session. So may we request the members of the audience to use the chat box to send in their questions, and they could be then addressed to by the respective speakers.
Yes, Priya, it's better if they send them through the Q&A because the chat is not active for everybody. So we're, please, Navras, we have 2 questions, I think.
Yes, we have a question from David Fox Estrin. He writes, I would be curious to hear the perspective of the scholars regarding the centrality of the term Holocaust in the literature and programs offered by collective memory institutions and scholars. For example, Holocaust and genocide as opposed to just genocide or genocide and human rights. Curious about how they believe outgroup, within inverted commas, and parenthetically, that is, non-Jewish people might perceive this for better or for worse towards our shared goals. So perhaps Tali, Charles could take this question, and then also perhaps Suzanne could answer this question. So shall we start with Tali?
Thank you. Thank you, Navras, and thank you, David, for an excellent question. Terminology of centers of memory or departments at universities or many others that have to make those decisions is key. And the question that we have to ask ourselves is what kind of consultations and what kind of stakeholders are you engaging in trying to find, in my opinion, in trying to find that the term that will work for everything in your institution. I can only speak about my institution, and I can talk about the years of consultation workshops that were done with survivors groups from Rwanda, from the Holocaust, from teachers, learners, other stakeholders in our setting, to try and find the term that will work for everyone. Support the curriculum, for example, for high school that has the Holocaust but doesn't have genocide in the curriculum, to support survivor memory and so on. And it's not easy. You do have to listen, and listen quite carefully. And then in the end, it is a compromise. But I feel quite good in making sure that I listened to everyone and included everyone in the narrative, both of the name, but also of the content of what the space is trying to present. But excellent question. And I do think that it's never an easy answer for those that are struggling to create these spaces.
Thank you, Tali. May I request Charles to also respond to this question?
Sure, glad to. I think it's not that the Holocaust is somehow special vis-a-vis other mass atrocities that you need to single it out. It is that it's well documented. It was a case of industrialized genocide to a degree that is not used elsewhere. And it's a good counterfoil we have found as an institution in our own Holocaust education and genocide prevention program, which was developed partly with the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, and asking them, what do they need? And they said, well, we're supposed to help prevent genocide in the developing world and the global South. And none of those countries, with a couple exceptions, are members of IRA. So we have no idea what's going on there. We know scholars down there are working in that space. We don't know who they are. We don't know what they're teaching. We don't know why they're doing it. And so we created a program in Holocaust education and genocide prevention that was global South focused. And the idea was to say, first of all, who's doing stuff down in these countries? Second of all, why are they doing it? And then how do we get them access to materials and to link with each other? So it's not a European organization going down and saying, here's what you have to learn. It's actually helping to connect people who in many cases were somewhat remote from each other. So the Holocaust became a good foil, we found, in talking to some of our colleagues in many countries around the world, because it was something perpetrated by Europeans against Europeans. So if you come from some other part of the world and you are dealing with your own country's troubles, and you're dealing with colonialism and everything else that's wrapped up together with that, it's very nice to say this has nothing to do with us. It's a bunch of Europeans murdering other Europeans. We can safely talk about this in our country and learn lessons from it. And then quietly, you can begin to use that as a tool to address issues in other countries. They don't have to be the same as the Holocaust. They don't have to be genocide. We avoid the legal definition of genocide. If it is an atrocity, and it could be apartheid, it could be, it doesn't have to rise to the level of the UN definition of genocide. If it is something like that, where there is mass suffering and mass atrocity, how do you confront that? And how do you confront it in a society where maybe the victims, the perpetrators, are still living next to each other? And how do you do this in a way which is respectful of the past, but allows society to move forward in the future as neighbors and co-citizens? So it's really a tool, using the term Holocaust, because there's so much educational material developed about it that can be shared. And in much of the world, it is neutral.
Thank you, Charles. Could Suzanne also respond to this question?
Yeah, very briefly, because I think following on from what Charles has just said, and I'm quoting Professor Yehuda Bar again, but he is one of the top scholars, and he always says that the Holocaust is a paradigm for genocide. And because of that, it becomes a very useful educative tool. it was an industrial form of murder, which was different to other genocides, but it also went across so many different countries in Europe, but also, North Africa. It wasn't just Europe. So, if Hitler would have got his way, it would have been the whole world. So it's a good question. It's a complex question, but that's why the term Holocaust is often used in conjunction, it seems to me, from an education point.
Thank you, Suzanne. We have in our midst another Salzburg fellow, Fawad Javed from Pakistan, and he invites comment from Charles to his observation that Muslim Central Eurasian countries, as part of the Soviet space from Azerbaijan to Kazakhstan, especially Uzbekistan, offered generous asylum to the Jews after 1933. They seem to have a more enlightened and fair approach to the Holocaust history till today.
I would get away from a narrative of Islam versus Judaism, which is a bit cliched, and I'd stay away from that. Muslims are not inherently the enemies of the Jews, and so if a Muslim does the right thing vis-a-vis a Jew, it has nothing to do with that. But these are countries which were not occupied by Germany, so the Holocaust was not perpetrated on their territory, which makes it easier for them to deal with this in this context. They're not dealing with missing Jews that disappeared from their population. They're not dealing with, did they collaborate or did they not collaborate? They were, the Germans were not there. So it's a different story. And where they took in Jews, it was more Jews fleeing east from the Germans and ending up in the Soviet Union, and in many cases deported to these areas for safety. How much freedom they had in the Soviet period is another area of discussion. But the fact that some of these people would have welcomed refugees in because of their own cultural affiliation to you treat refugees with a certain amount of respect. The one Muslim majority country in Europe which has an experience with this is Albania, of course, and Albania took in refugees, not just during the period of Italian occupation, the Italians weren't doing much, but a period of German occupation after Germany invaded Italy. So the last 2 years of the war, they were still accepting refugees, and the Jewish population in Albania was 10 times larger at the end of the Holocaust than at the beginning. And they seem to have turned over, according to scholars, one family because they were communists rather than because they were Jews. And other than that, they treated these Jewish refugees as sacred and did everything they could to protect them. So I wouldn't make, and of course there's cases in North Africa and other Muslim countries where there were quite a lot of righteous among the Gentiles, righteous among the nations, recognized by Yad Vashem as such. And so it's not a Muslim versus Jewish thing, and I don't really like that narrative. I think it can be politicized in the wrong way.
Thank you very much, Charles.
Navras, if I may, can I ask a question to Tali?
Sure, Rituparna, please go ahead.
Hello, Tali. I really liked your presentation, and I wanted to ask you, that thing about never again has haunted me for years now. Particularly as in India, we keep repeating the same thing actually over every few years. We are reminded of the partition, apart from its, the other memories. I will definitely visit your website, the museum that you talked about. I was just curious, as we are we are actually gearing up for the launch of a virtual museum next year. We have a team of 10 people already working on it. Is there any online exhibition of your museum which can be accessed virtually? Then I would, I'm really interested to know and learn a little more about your museum. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yes, indeed. And I would love to you know, I read your chapter, but I would love to hear more about the use of.
I'm sorry, but you know, my chapter is not really a chapter. I'm hugely dissatisfied. It's not an academic article. It is, you know, I had huge reservations. Navras knows that. So, but anyway, it's a work in progress, and I just tried to say what we're trying to do. So, yeah.
Exactly. But just speaking about what I liked is speaking about other things that are usually not in museums. And you spoke about the cuisine, about the you know, the articles of clothing and about the art. And I think that is what many museums are missing. Our museum is full of music. It has poetry on the walls. It has voices. It has drawings. It has films, about 24 films. And these are the things that I always felt are missing in your 20th century museum. So I believe that in the 21st century museum, you do need to not read a book on the wall. You need to go down and go up to listen to, you know, to activate your body. And that's what we did. And our website is full of little virtual tours of different areas. There is the music, some of the music that you can access on the website. And please just feel free to write to me. Navras and Priya knows, and I'll send you more, you know, that we are working
If I may beat our drum a little more here, just taking this opportunity, is that, you know, in the run up to we don't have space yet. And because soon after our existence, we started and the pandemic happened. We had just a year. So we've done a number of events, and, you know, we believe in the importance of art and preserving cultural memory. So our major events have been centered around art. Films, we just had a very successful art exhibition, which looks at partition very differently, not just rupture. So yeah, I'm absolutely very excited to see more and learn more about the museum. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions?
No, we don't have any questions, and we have also run out of time for the questions now. So it's time for us to end the session. We have already consumed all the time that we had. Thank you.
The conversations can continue, I guess, informally, but may I request Dr. Yael Siman, an associate professor at the Department of Sociology and Political Science at the Iberoamericana University, to kindly officially close the proceedings for day one.
Thank you so much, Priya. Yes, so on behalf of the Department of Social and Political Science at Iberoamericana University in Mexico City, I would like to thank the panelists for their extraordinary presentations. I would also like to express my appreciation to the participants, and a special thank you to the co-editors of this book, Priya, Singh, and Navras Aafreedi, as well as to our partners to this event, the Ackerman Center for Holocaust Studies at UT Dallas, Asia in Global Affairs, University of Sydney's Department of Hebrew, Biblical, and Jewish Studies, the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center, the Holocaust and Genocide Studies Program at Kean University, Salzburg Global Seminar, and Bengal State University. This is a truly global effort that I hope will continue in the very near future. Mass violence is part of humanity's past, and unfortunately also of our present. Thus, the relevance and significance of this very important book. Today's presentations have raised many important questions. With humility, I just mentioned some of them. What it means to be at the margins of a nation-state project. Can partition and fragmentation take hold where cultural continuities are present? How to conceptualize the history of mass violence if this history is in itself socially constructed? How to recollect and represent victimhood without reinvigorating the trauma? How is the narrative of mass violence shaped by local museum settings? Is the main role of the Holocaust and Genocide museums and memorials to confront our violent pasts, to combat anti-Semitism and prejudice, to prevent genocide? Or given the pervasiveness of mass violence, are we confronted with the need to rethink and reconceptualize their social role? And finally, how do we remember not only the history of mass violence, but also its legacies? Thank you all for your extraordinary presentations. I also want to mention that tomorrow we have a second book launch with other panelists. And so here is the link to the registration. And lastly, if you are interested in buying the book, I just realized yesterday as I was purchasing an additional copy that there is a 20% discount back to school promotion by Routledge. So here is a link to their webpage, so you can purchase it or maybe ask our institutions to get a copy for our students. So thank you very much, and I hope to see you soon. Thank you. Gracias.
Gracias.
Good night.